Shocking details of the massacre at Kibbutz Kfar Aza are contained in another chapter in another report from the Internal Army Investigation, which was published yesterday. When I read this report, I had the feeling that it was some kind of concentrate of that failure of October 7th. And everything that could have failed, everything that could have happened, all happened in Kibbutz Kfar Aza, not just there, of course. But among other things, in Kfar Aza, for example, the looters from Gaza, the so-called civilians who robbed the border settlements and kibbutz there, did not get there. Only armed terrorists were active there, only militants. And at the same time, 64 people were killed and 19 were abducted and taken to Gaza. At the same time, they were in the kibbutz. A division commander and 3 brigade commanders, not to mention lower-ranking officers, around 700 soldiers at their peak. And they couldn't organize themselves. They couldn't put up a worthy resistance against the terrorists. And part of the kibbutz, the so-called youth quarter, was only brought under control by the evening of October 7th. And even then, not completely. It was a truly deafening failure. Some kind of monstrous absolute. And when they write in the report, the authors of the report, they write the following, that the results of the investigation into the massacre in Kibbutz Kfar Aza clearly show that the IDF did not fulfill its task and did not protect the residents of the kibbutz. I don't know what kind of Captain Obvious wrote this conclusion, but that's not the problem. The IDF did not fulfill its mission to protect the state of Israel if the terrorists made it to Afakim, to Sderot, and only by a miracle did not reach Ashkelon and Ashdod. So unfortunately, Kfar Aza is a significant example of this. Just one episode, and not even the most horrifying or the largest in scale of what was happening in Israel on October 7th, 8th, and 9th. Hello everyone, my name is Sergey Auslender. You're on my channel. Please support this video, like, subscribe, comment, everything's as usual. It's all pretty simple. Turn on notifications, the bell if you haven't done so yet. You can support the channel financially. It's such gratitude for our work. The super thanks button, super thanks, or the heart with a $sign. 2 platforms, Boosty and Patreon. Links to them are in the description, and you can become a sponsor of the channel on YouTube. This is important. And a huge thank you to everyone who does this. We'll also have a video about the Shabak investigation, the investigation into the failure of the Shabak, or rather the security service. During Aviv Kochavi's time, who was the chief of staff before Herzl Halevi, a certain order was introduced. The fighters are at their combat posts. They stay for 11 days around the Gaza Strip, then they're sent home for 4 days and back for another 11 after that. In short, that's the story, but during the weekends and every holiday, half of the Israeli army's forces that are supposed to be there remain in the border zone. This time it was even less than half, but the fact that half of the soldiers, half of the servicemen were there was something the terrorists obviously knew, so it was pretty much predictable that if an attack were to happen, it would either be on Shabbat or during a holiday. It was already quite obvious when combat readiness sharply decreases. As for the Kibbutz Kfar Aza, it's located just not far from the border. There is a fence there, but it didn't have cameras, and there weren't any at that moment. There is a Kunit group, a rapid response team, or rather there was, but now they will probably be organizing it again. There were 15 people in it, and they didn't have any long-barreled weapons, that is, automatic weapons, assault rifles. They were stored in the armory, and they didn't have radios to communicate with each other. So communication could only be done through phones and various messengers. Shachar Aviani was in command. This is the security coordinator, the so-called rap shots. He died in the first half hour of the battle. So by 7 in the morning, he was already dead. So I remind you, the attack has begun, the first wave of the attack, when Israel was subjected to intense rocket and mortar fire, including Kfar Aza. And one of the first to witness all of this was Roy Idan. He was a photographer for the Waynut portal. He was killed. And he took the first photographs. They were later found, and he filmed Hamas paragliders landing in Kfar Aza. Is a pretty famous video. She also has it. You can find it on the internet online. Here he is commenting on Komi, hearing sirens, hearing gunfire, seeing rockets, and seeing a pair of gliders landing on the territory of the kibbutz of Kfar. And before 8:30, that is 2 hours earlier, about 100 terrorists broke into the kibbutz. So, about a company, they killed 37 people, half of the self-defense unit from Kfar Aza and Nud. And accordingly, 7 fighters and 30 civilians. As it turned out later, there was an order to carry out mass killings. The first wave kills 2, kidnaps. That was the order. The consequences were revealed from documents seized from the terrorists. They had various plans, notes, and interrogations of captured militants. So the first wave was supposed to kill as many people as possible, set fire to the kibbutz, basically sow chaos, and so on. It turned out, among other things, in the investigation by the general staff, that the terrorists planned to capture 2 kibbutzim. This is Be'eri and Kfar Aza. Look at the map. You can see that from the city of Gaza, they attacked in diverging directions towards Be'eri and Kfar Aza. They were supposed to capture these 2 kibbutzim. This was the main direction of the attack. What they have achieved in other areas is, in fact, evidence such a monstrous failure. And the fact that they reached Sderot, the fact that they reached Afakim and tried to break into Ashkelon, all of this is, so to speak, links in the same chain. In the kibbutz, which was completely under the control of terrorists, yes, the whole place was captured, the whole territory was controlled. There were 7 members of the self-defense unit and about 150 terrorists left. Against them, that is, well, their advantage was absolute, overwhelming, while the kibbutz members had pistols and the terrorists had a full range of weapons, from anti-tank missiles to machine guns, their automatic weapons, handheld grenade launchers, and so on, plus. They were supported by mortar fire from the territory of the Gaza Strip. By the way, they were doing quite well. This is noted in the army report. There was even established coordination with their artillery, with mortars, seriously. See, they were that well prepared. So, as I already mentioned, the balance of forces was like this, and until there were no soldiers from the army there. They infiltrated the so-called youth quarter of the kibbutz, where young families lived, and they also started killing, abducting, setting fires, and so on. And the second wave of terrorists arrived, and by the 12th, the third wave of terrorists. And at the peak, there were up to 300 militants. At the same time, there were up to 300 militants in a relatively small settlement. At the time of the attack, Brigadier General Israel Shomer was in the kibbutz. He is the commander of the Amapatz division. It is stationed, deployed in the north. He was just on vacation at his short home. He lives in Kfar Aza. He called the chief of staff, Herzl Halevi, and explained the situation as he saw it from his home. After that, Herzl Halevi, who was driving south, turned around and headed to Kiryat, to the general staff, apparently to lead the operation from there. Neither his arrival in the south, nor him staying in the general staff, it wouldn't have helped much either, because there was absolute chaos and everyone was fighting for themselves, just like General Shomer was. He attacked the terrorist with a knife and stabbed him. He took the weapon from him and started fighting with a pistol. Then he got his hands on an automatic rifle. Then some fighters, survivors from the Kitat, joined him from the Rapid Response Unit. He was leading their actions there, but basically he was in charge of a pretty small unit. He couldn't take command over a larger force because chaos reigned. At the very beginning of the fight, 3 armored jeeps belonging to the Holland Brigade unit approached the kibbutz but saw a large number of terrorists around the kibbutz. They then moved towards the Nahal Oz base for reinforcements around the kibbutz, and they moved towards the Nahal Oz base for reinforcements. But Nahal Oz itself was surrounded. It had been captured. There was heavy fighting there. And in addition, they started being shelled with anti-tank missiles. And they drove to Sderot. They drove to Sderot and joined the police in the battle for the police station. And there, actually, they were located. They left the kibbutz at Kfar Aza. Then a unit of Sayeret Matkal arrived. This is the General Staff Special Forces. These are very highly trained fighters. But again, highly trained fighters, when there are, let's say, 20 of them and 300 terrorists, won't be able to do anything, especially without heavy weapons, without armored vehicles, tanks, artillery, air support, and so on. The aviation didn't appear over Kfar Aza at all until noon. And the commander of the Sayeret Matkal unit, caught under heavy fire, pulled his fighters out of the kibbutz. So he brought them outside beyond the perimeter of the kibbutz because he couldn't assess the situation in any way. Once again, at the peak, there were 3 of the brigade commander, the general, the division commander. By the way, he called his division. He ordered his deputy to put the division on alert, instructed to break into the untouched reserves, urgently arm people, and deploy the equipment because he was worried, and quite rightly, that at the same time there would be an offensive by Hezbollah in the north. But thankfully that didn't happen. But I have to say, in this sense, he showed quite the right initiative. He brought his division to combat readiness with just one call, after which he continued to fight inside the kibbutz. He was providing assistance to the wounded. There is evidence that, upon discovering an injured civilian, he applied a tourniquet and thereby saved his life. Otherwise, he would have bled out here, and there were such cases. So he was providing assistance. He was fighting, moving from house to house. What was noted is that the terrorists had very detailed maps of the kibbutz and the surrounding area. Let's say they clearly knew which roads connected Kfar Aza with other settlements, and as they say, with the mainland, and those roads were intercepted right away. So any attempt to send reinforcements was met with ambushes, so-called cut-off ambushes. The terrorists were waiting there. They were fighting back, not letting anyone get through to the kibbutz, while the main group of militants was kidnapping and killing the residents of the kibbutz. In addition, within the kibbutz itself, the houses of the self-defense unit fighters were marked separately. Their weapons were in the armory. They broke through to it. The armory was marked separately. The first thing the terrorists did was to break in and set up an ambush there so that no one could get through, and they surrounded the houses of the self-defense unit fighters to prevent them from entering the fight. Nevertheless, the security officer managed to organize something at the very beginning, but he was killed half an hour after the fighting started. And after that, control was completely lost. And this went on like that until afternoon, that is, until noon precisely, and a couple of hours after that, quite large forces were arriving at the kibbutz. These were scattered units, but there were many of them. About 750 armed soldiers were either at the gates of the kibbutz or conditionally at the entrance to the kibbutz. But no one could organize them, and no one understood the situation. No one could organize interaction with the aviation, which was already starting to appear there. No one could organize interaction with each other either. All attempts to enter the kibbutz were met with heavy fire from the militants. They were taking positions there in the bushes on the rooftops of the houses. It was impossible to determine the sources of the fire. There were no drones, and accordingly that meant drones. To be precise, there were no military ones. No one could to assess the situation, and only after lunch, one of the officers, you're not going to believe this, he probably opened a WhatsApp group. I don't know what it was called, but he opened a WhatsApp group. Officers who were arriving at the kibbutz started to join in there, and an improvised headquarters was set up at the entrance to the kibbutz. Through this WhatsApp group, they started exchanging messages, and some semblance of organization emerged, after which the army gradually began to deploy there and started moving into the kibbutz. All this time, literally, all these minutes, the killings continued. Abductions. The hostages were being taken into Gaza, but the army couldn't do anything yet until it happened. This relatively spontaneous self-organization and all of it continued until the evening. So actually, this continued through the night. It quieted down, and in the morning, everything resumed. And practically the whole day, October 8th. The next day after the 7th, the army was involved in evacuating the surviving residents. Those who managed to hide in the mamads, those who were able to lock themselves in, who defended themselves from the self-defense units. 10 hours later, 2 10-month-old children were found. They were the family's twins. Berdishev family. They have mom and dad, Adara and Tai. They were both officers. They locked it. They laid the kids down in the mamad and went out to fight off the terrorists, taking out a few, but ultimately losing their own lives in the battle. And here, the children were saved. The children turned out to be alive. When the military entered the house, the children were alive, thank God. And it continued like this, actually, all the way until the 9th. By the 9th, they completed the evacuation of the residents of the kibbutz and the last terrorist. They were eliminated, decoquient, on October 10th. So for 3 days, from the 7th to the 10th, the army couldn't fully take control of a very small settlement. That's how everything happened. It was all terrible. It was all nightmarish. And all of this is evidence of an absolutely horrific failure that occurred on October 7th. And it happened, among other things, at the command level, meaning that for at least a day, the general staff couldn't regain control. Actually, one of the main points in this report is the disconnect between how the troops were operating on the ground, heroically resisting the terrorists, fighting them, battling 1 against 10, and so on, and how the general staff was directing the battle in the south, just like that. So for many hours, the general staff couldn't regain control over the troops. There are quite a few details in there, and they're very unpleasant. Well, let's say that many commanders, including those from the Gaz division and the Rod commanders, went home for the weekend without even taking their personal weapons with them. Many of them tried to return to the combat zone while being unarmed. At that time, the headquarters of the Gaz division, the base in Rome, was captured. There was fighting in the kibbutzim and so on, and here's the lack of weapons among many military personnel. This also became a reason for them either to perish or to be unable to do anything. The same General Sumer, with a knife, began, so to speak, his combat path in the kibbutz to Faraza. Thank God he remained alive. By the evening of October 7th, by the way, he had already left for the north because he was afraid that it would start there too. Overall, he acted heroically, no doubt about that, but the problem is that he couldn't organize anything. Resistance against the terrorists. But again, it's not really his fault, it's more of a tragedy. Because he didn't have the tools for that. The troops were arriving chaotically, the troops were acting chaotically, they were going into the kibbutz and coming out of the kibbutz. And so all of this was happening together. And unfortunately, this great tragedy wasn't just happening in Faraza, it was happening everywhere. In the same Nahal Oz outpost, it was recently revealed about the outpost, as Duko Levi mentioned, that the relocation of the Nahal Oz outpost was discussed in the general staff, including during his time as the chief of staff, but also previously when he was the brigade commander. He thought about it, what a bad thing when an outpost, a military base, it's poorly protected and barely defended, located just hundreds of meters from the border, literally, that it's not good and it should be moved somewhere deeper. Yeah, but this wasn't done, as he put it, for budgetary reasons. 200 million shekels. Well, 200 million shekels is 50 million euros. Just like that. I want to say that it's not such a huge amount of money for the Israeli budget, considering how it's been spent around here lately, and actually even before that. It's not such a huge amount of money. The problem wasn't that at Nahal Oz, by the way, the girls who were soldiers, those from the observation unit of Tzafitaniot, were captured and many of them were killed. Most of the girls were killed and many were captured, 7 of them. So that there were many such outposts around. Yes, if they broke through to the kibbutzer, for them, to the headquarters of the Gaz division, that's a separate issue. It raises the question of who even thought it was a good idea to place the headquarters of the territorial division, which manages the entire sector, just 2 kilometers from the border fence. That's a whole different story. Why wasn't it moved deeper? Although it's clear that such a division headquarters should be located somewhere. It was somewhere there, I don't know, around Sderot at best, but Sderot is also not far away, again. So it should have been located somewhere else and been fortified differently. There are a lot of conclusions that indicate that the readiness of these point now has to be constant. It's not like that on weekdays they are combat ready, but on weekends they are not very combat ready. It can't be like that anymore. Now they all need to be given weapons and not rely on barriers anymore, because as it turned out, the barriers can be blown up very easily, like the 144 breaches that were made. In the wall, I remind you, yes, and most of them were either made by bulldozers, knocked down or blown up, and they penetrated through those, and the soldiers couldn't do anything. Even where they tried to organize some resistance, they were simply overwhelmed by numbers. Well, when you have 10 people, like it was at one of the bases, and against you are 100 terrorists, well, you can't do anything. Hold out for a while, yes, but if only reinforcements arrived, but there were no reinforcements, the general staff couldn't figure out what was happening. Precious time was slipping away. They were searching for hostages. People were being killed. And they led like this, and they led like that, and they led like this, and they led like that, and so on. I really hope that some conclusions will finally be drawn from all of this, because we've already been through this once. 50 years ago, there was the Yom Kippur War, and the Yom Kippur War was also a nightmare. Absolutely a failure. The same thing happened on the Bar-Lev line, which everyone thought was impregnable. But the Egyptians broke through it in just a few hours and practically took complete control. Except for one fortified point, it seems, Budapest, it was called that, which held out for a long time until they ran out of ammunition, and so on and so on and so on. And that's all should lead to some radical. The main conclusion and change regarding this should also be addressed by the State Commission. Well, we recorded a separate video about the State Commission, and we'll upload it soon and show it to you. My colleague and I talked about this, about what a State Commission actually is, and what its powers are, what it should do, and so on in general. To put it simply, the approach needs to change. Here's what I believe. It's not the number of soldiers and tanks at the border, not the thickness of the barriers, or the amount of barbed wire, and so on. No, we need to change our approaches, so we will change our approaches, then we will feel relatively safe. And maybe if there were guarantees that this wouldn't happen again. Thank you for watching my videos. Please don't forget to support, and I'll see you all soon. Bye for now.